$3 million. That number feels like an arrival. Like you finally made it across the finish line. And in many ways you did. You spent 30, maybe 40 years making the right calls, saving when everyone else was spending, staying the course when markets got ugly. $3 million in retirement accounts is not luck. It's discipline. But here's something most financial content won't tell you up front. With a $3 million portfolio, following the conventional withdrawal advice could leave you with less than $8,500 a month in real spending money, after taxes, after inflation, in 2026. That's not a typo. That's the math. A couple pulls $120,000 a year using the standard 4% rule. Sounds clean. But then comes the capital gains tax, the Medicare surtax, maybe state taxes depending on where you live. And underneath all of that, inflation is quietly shrinking what every dollar actually buys, especially healthcare and housing, which are the two things retirees spend the most on. The number in your account and the money you actually live on are two very different things. I've watched people sit across from me, smart, successful people, who had done everything right and still felt blindsided. Not because they made bad investments, but because nobody told them the withdrawal order matters just as much as the balance. Today, we're going to walk through what life with $3 million actually looks like. Why the common advice to spend your taxable brokerage account first could quietly cost your kids hundreds of thousands of dollars. And how a concept called cash drag is eating into retirement portfolios that, on paper, look completely fine. None of this is complicated. But it does require slowing down and looking past the headline number. Let's put a face on this. Dan and Mary, both 64, recently retired, living in Florida. Combined, they've built $3,300,000 across 3 accounts, $1 million in a taxable brokerage, $2 million in Dan's 401k, and $300,000 in a Roth IRA. By any measure, they're in good shape. And when they sat down with their financial advisor, they got advice that sounded completely reasonable. Spend the brokerage account first. Let the 401k keep growing tax deferred. Touch the Roth last. This is the conventional withdrawal order. You'll find it in books, in YouTube videos, on every major financial planning site. The logic isn't wrong on the surface. Why pay taxes now if you can delay them? But here's where the math gets uncomfortable. Dan needs $120,000 a year to live the retirement he planned. He pulls that from the brokerage. Now, that $120,000 isn't just income. It's a capital gains event. Under 2026 IRS rules, a married couple with that level of income hits the 15% capital gains rate. And if their total income crosses $583,750, they also owe an additional 3.8% net investment income tax on top of that. So that $120,000 withdrawal, after taxes, Dan and Mary are actually living on closer to $97,000, not $120,000. That gap adds up. Over 5 years, they've paid somewhere between $100,000 and $115,000 in taxes on money they already earned once. Now, you might be thinking, that's just how taxes work. And you're right. Taxes are part of the picture. What Dan didn't realize is that this strategy has a second cost, one that doesn't show up in any tax bill. Wanting to protect your 401k and let it grow as long as possible, that instinct makes complete sense. That's the discipline of someone who spent decades building this. It's not a mistake in character. The mistake is in timing. Every year Dan pulls from the brokerage, he's liquidating assets that carry something called an unrealized gain. Stock he bought at $30 that's now worth $180. Positions he's held for 20 years. And the moment he sells, even gradually, he's permanently giving up something that the tax code would have handed to his children completely free. That's the trap. It's not greed or bad planning. It's optimizing for the wrong time horizon. Dan is solving for this year's tax bill while quietly destroying next generation's inheritance. Why does spending the brokerage first hurt the people you're trying to leave something to? The answer sits inside a tax mechanism that most financial content glosses over, and that's exactly where we're going next. There's a mechanism inside the tax code that the wealthiest families in America have used for generations. It's not a loophole in the shady sense. It's written right into the law. And most people retiring with $3 million or $4 million have never heard of it explained clearly. It's called a step up in basis. Here's how it works. Dan bought Apple shares years ago at $10 a share. Today, those shares are worth $200. On paper, that's a $190 gain per share. If Dan sells those shares today to fund retirement, he owes capital gains tax on that $190. At 15%, that's $28.50 per share, gone. But if Dan holds those shares and passes them to his kids when he dies, something different happens. His children inherit the shares at the current market value, $200. That becomes their new cost basis. If they turn around and sell the next day, their taxable gain is zero. The entire $190 of growth passes to them completely tax-free. That's not a rounding error. On a $1 million brokerage account with significant unrealized gains, the difference between selling now and holding until inheritance can easily reach $150,000 to $200,000 in taxes. Taxes that simply disappear if the account is handled correctly. I'll be honest with you. 10 years ago, I was recommending the same thing most advisors still recommend today. Spend the brokerage first, protect the 401k, delay the tax bill. It made sense on paper. Then I watched a client's son write a check for $180,000 in capital gains taxes on an inheritance. Money that could have transferred completely free if we'd made a different call 5 years earlier. That changed how I think about withdrawal sequencing entirely. So what does the better approach look like? Instead of defaulting to one account, Dan uses what's called a hybrid withdrawal strategy. He leaves the brokerage account largely untouched, letting it grow and preserving that step-up benefit for his kids. Meanwhile, starting now, before he hits age 75 and required minimum distributions kick in, he begins pulling from the 401k strategically. Not large amounts, just enough to fill the lower tax brackets, the 10% and 12% bands, each year. In 2026, a married couple can take roughly $94,000 from the 401k and stay within the 12% bracket. Dan pays a modest tax now, shrinks the future RMD bomb, and keeps the brokerage intact as a legacy asset. The brokerage account stops being a spending account. It becomes a growth engine with a tax-free exit built in. Money is math, but retirement is psychology. And even with a near-perfect tax strategy, there's a different kind of fear that keeps Gen X from pulling the trigger, one that has nothing to do with brackets or basis. Dan has $3,300,000. By every reasonable measure, he can retire. His financial plan says he can retire. His advisor says he can retire. He's still going back to work on Monday, not because he has to, because $3 million doesn't feel like enough. Maybe it feels too round, too clean. Maybe the market had a rough quarter, and now the number looks smaller than it did 6 months ago. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Dan has been building this for 40 years, and stopping feels less like a finish line and more like stepping off a ledge. This is what researchers call one more year syndrome. One more year of income. One more year of contributions. One more year of not touching the principal. Then $3 million becomes $3.4 million, and $3.4 million still doesn't feel like enough, so the target shifts to $4 million. And the years keep moving. I've been close to enough people in this situation to know this isn't about the math. The math was settled a long time ago. This is about what 40 years of accumulating does to your nervous system. You get very good at building and very uncomfortable with the idea of spending. That discomfort is not a character flaw. Spending down an account you spent decades filling goes against every financial habit that got you here. Of course it feels wrong. Of course it triggers something. But here's what one more year actually costs. If Dan works an extra 2 years earning $150,000, he adds roughly $300,000 gross to his net worth. Maybe $210,000 after taxes. Meanwhile, he spent 2 years not retiring. 2 years of time he cannot get back during what are statistically his healthiest and most mobile years of retirement. That's the trade-off that doesn't show up in any spreadsheet. So instead of staring at the total balance, try shifting the question entirely. Don't ask, do I have enough? Ask instead, what does my floor look like? If Dan's Social Security comes in at $42,000 a year combined, and he withdraws just 3% from his portfolio, that's another $99,000. Together, that's $141,000 a year before he touches a single dollar of the Roth or the brokerage. At that point, every additional dollar in the portfolio isn't survival money. It's flexibility money. It's the difference between a good retirement and a great one. But it's not the thing standing between Dan and being okay. The floor is already there. What Dan is really waiting for is permission. And while Dan is working that out, Mary has already decided she wants a safety net. A big one. She's heard about the bucket strategy. She likes the idea of years of cash sitting untouched, and it genuinely helps her sleep at night. The problem is what that cash is quietly doing, or more accurately, what it's failing to do. Mary watched 2022 happen in real time. She saw a balanced portfolio drop 16%, 17%, 18% in a single year. She watched neighbors panic sell. She read the headlines. And she made a decision when they retired she was never going to be in a position where a bad market year forced her to sell stocks at the worst possible moment. So Mary wants a war chest. 6 years of living expenses sitting in a high-yield savings account. At $120,000 a year, that's $720,000 in cash. Safe, liquid, untouchable by whatever the market decides to do. The fear behind that decision is completely legitimate. There's a real phenomenon called sequence of returns risk, and it's one of the most underappreciated threats in retirement planning. The idea is straightforward. 2 people can have identical average returns over 30 years, but if one of them experiences a major market drop in year 1 or 2 of retirement, right when they start withdrawing, their portfolio may never fully recover. The order of the returns matters, not just the average. Mary isn't wrong to take this seriously. A fidelity analysis puts the projected healthcare costs for a 65-year-old couple at around $165,000 out of pocket over retirement beyond what Medicare covers. That number alone is enough to make anyone want more cash on hand. When you add sequence of returns risk on top of it, holding a large cash buffer feels like the responsible move. And it is responsible up to a point. The part that doesn't get talked about is what a $720,000 cash position actually costs over time. Not in fees, not in taxes, in purchasing power. Retirees don't experience inflation the same way the general CPI measures it. Healthcare costs, home maintenance, insurance premiums, assisted living, these tend to run hotter than the headline number. While the overall inflation rate might sit around 3%, the real cost of living for someone in their late 60s and 70s often tracks closer to 4% or 5% annually. If Mary's cash earns 4% in a high-yield account, but her actual cost of living rises at 5%, she's losing 1% of real purchasing power every single year. That doesn't sound like much. But after 20 years, that $720,000 war chest has lost nearly 20% of what it can actually buy. The account balance stays the same. The life it funds gets smaller. That's cash drag. And it's one of those costs that never shows up as a line item, which is exactly why it's so easy to miss until it's already done its damage. Mary went looking for safety. What she built instead was a slow leak. So if a $720,000 cash position is too much and going fully invested feels too exposed, where does that leave Mary? This is where most retirement content stops. It tells you what not to do, then leaves you with a vague instruction to find balance. That's not useful. So let's get specific. I had a client held $800,000 in cash from 2020 onward. He'd watched the COVID crash happen almost overnight, and he decided he was done taking that kind of risk with money he'd already earned. Completely understandable. But by early 2026, that $800,000 was still $800,000. Meanwhile, the condo he'd been planning to buy as a retirement home had gone from $680,000 to just over $900,000. The money hadn't moved. The world had. That's not a market story. That's a purchasing power story. And it's the one most people don't see coming. The fix isn't to eliminate the cash buffer. It's to right-size it. Instead of a static war chest, consider what's called a dynamic guardrails approach. The core idea is simple. Keep 2 years of living expenses in cash or near cash, roughly $240,000 for Dan and Mary. Everything else stays invested in a growth-oriented portfolio. Now, $240,000 versus $720,000 is a difference of $480,000 sitting back in the market. At a conservative 6% average annual return, that $480,000 generates roughly $28,800 in additional growth per year. Over 20 years, the compounding gap between those two choices runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's the cost of excess caution. It's real, even if it never appears on a statement. But the dynamic guardrails framework doesn't just right-size the cash buffer. It also builds in a behavioral rule. If the portfolio drops below a set threshold, say 15% to 20% down from its peak, Dan and Mary automatically reduce their discretionary spending by 10%. Not a crisis, not a panic sell, just a planned, pre-agreed adjustment that protects the portfolio without forcing bad decisions in bad markets. This matters because the biggest risk in a down market isn't the market itself. It's what people do when they're scared. Having a rule in place before the fear arrives means you're not making that call under pressure. 2 years of cash handles the short term. The guardrail handles the psychology. And the rest of the portfolio keeps working. The war chest strategy feels safe because it's simple and visible. But simple and visible isn't always the same as protected. To see why that distinction matters, it helps to stress test this against something real, a scenario where both risks show up at the same time. Let's put the two approaches side by side and run them through the worst case. It's year 2 of Dan and Mary's retirement. The market drops 25%. Not unusual. It happened in 2022. It happened in 2008. It will happen again at some point. At the same time, Mary gets a diagnosis that requires ongoing care. The kind of care that runs $10,000 a month based on current long-term care cost estimates. Suddenly, the retirement plan isn't theoretical anymore. Here's what happens to the couple who followed the conventional advice. They have $720,000 sitting in cash, so the immediate bills are covered. But their brokerage account, the one they've been drawing from every year, has dropped from $1 million to $750,000. And they still need income. So they sell. They lock in those losses at the bottom, permanently reducing the number of shares that will participate in the eventual recovery. Meanwhile, the 401k keeps growing, which sounds fine until you realize that a larger 401k means larger, required minimum distributions later, taxed as ordinary income, potentially pushing them into a higher bracket at the exact moment they can least afford it. The portfolio doesn't recover. Not fully. Not in the time they have left. Now here's what happens when Dan and Mary are using the framework. The 2 years of cash, $240,000, covers Mary's care immediately. No selling. No panic. They have time to think clearly. During that window, Dan begins pulling from the 401k at a controlled rate, staying within the 12% tax bracket, using that income to cover ongoing expenses, while the brokerage account sits untouched and waits for the market to come back. The guardrail kicks in automatically. They trim discretionary spending by 10%. Dinners out become dinners in. The vacation gets pushed 6 months. Not a sacrifice. Just a planned adjustment that keeps the portfolio intact through the bottom. When the market recovers, the brokerage account recovers with it. The step up in basis is preserved. The tax bill that would have fallen on their kids disappears. Same market, same diagnosis. 2 completely different outcomes. The difference wasn't luck or income or even the size of the portfolio. It was the order of decisions made before the crisis arrived. So if you're sitting somewhere between $1 million and $5 million heading into retirement, what does this actually mean for you? Not in theory, in practice. Starting now. 3 moves. In order. The first one is an audit of your brokerage account. Pull up every position and look at the cost basis, the original price you paid for each holding. If you have stocks or funds sitting on large unrealized gains, those are assets you want to think very carefully about before selling. Do not rebalance your taxable account blindly just because the allocation looks off. Every sale is a taxable event, and some of those positions may be worth far more to your heirs intact than they are to you liquidated. The second move is to start thinking seriously about Roth conversions. Between now and age 75, when required minimum distributions begin, there's a window, sometimes called the tax valley, where your taxable income is lower than it will ever be again. Use that window. Move money from your 401k into a Roth IRA each year, up to the top of the 12% bracket. You pay a modest tax now. In exchange, that money grows tax-free. It never triggers an RMD. And when your kids inherit it, they pull it out tax-free too. If you don't do this, the 401k keeps growing. By the time RMDs hit at 75, the mandatory withdrawals could push you into the 22% or 24% bracket, whether you need the money or not. You're not avoiding that tax. You're just deferring it, and probably at a higher rate, and passing the remainder of the problem to your children at the peak of their own earning years. That's not a gift. That's a tax bomb with a delayed fuse. The third move is to set your guardrails before you need them. Decide right now what your baseline spending looks like. The number that covers housing, healthcare, food, and utilities. Then decide what your comfortable spending looks like on top of that. If the portfolio drops below a set threshold, you already know which category takes the cut. You don't have to make that decision under stress. It's already made. The 4% rule is a starting point, not a strategy. Your actual number depends on your tax situation, your account mix, your health, and how much of this you want to leave behind. Those variables are yours. The framework for thinking about them is what we've been building today. Retiring with $3 million is a real achievement. Nobody should walk away from this video feeling like it isn't. But a large balance and a well-structured retirement are not the same thing. The tax code doesn't care how hard you worked to build this. It will take exactly what it's owed, and if the withdrawal order is wrong, it will take more than it needs to, and pass the rest of the bill to your kids. What we covered today isn't about squeezing every last dollar. It's about not leaving money on the table that was never meant for the IRS in the first place. Keep the brokerage account intact where you can. Use the tax valley for Roth conversions while the brackets are still in your favor. Right-size the cash buffer so it protects you without quietly eroding what you've built. And set the guardrails before you need them, not during a downturn when every decision feels urgent. The math on all of this is not complicated. The hard part is doing it before it feels necessary. Because by the time it feels necessary, some of the best options are already gone. If the step up in basis and cash drag conversation today gave you a clearer picture of what's actually at stake, hit subscribe. We don't talk about beating the market here. We talk about keeping what you've already earned. I'm Wes. My job is to help you spend your money without regret.